What happens when a vast enterprise is rocked by a private family letter? Finally, JW and Rebecca have spoken, and what they have to say is more explosive than anyone could have predicted. The letter, written in black and white, reveals details Daystar never wanted the public to know and lifts the veil from Joni Lamb's meticulously constructed persona. This is more than simply drama. This shocking discovery has the potential to alter our entire understanding of faith, authority, and treachery. The narrative surrounding Daystar appeared to be meticulously managed for months. Joni Lamb repeatedly stated the same thing while standing in front of cameras with confidence and firmness. There was no proof that Pete was guilty. Her statements were significant to fans. She was more than a distraught widow carrying on her husband's legacy. She was someone people wanted to trust, a leader, and a devout woman. Furthermore, it seemed credible when she claimed that Pete had only been implicated by Jonathan and Susie. Two voices could easily be written off as resentful, furious, or deceived. It was a good story, and it worked for a time. Then, however, a letter appeared. From within her own family, not from criticism or outsiders. JW, Joni's own son-in-law and the husband of her daughter Rebecca, wrote it. Additionally, he outlined events that he had seen firsthand. Pete's actions toward Jonathan and Susie's small daughter went beyond bounds that no one could justify. The letter was neither ambiguous nor conjectural. It was lucid, thorough, and incredibly unnerving. JW was present. He had witnessed enough to write down his opinions and forward them to Daystar's board. Joni's entire well-crafted story was shattered by just one deed. The letter's power lay not just in its content but also in its source. One could write off outsiders as jealous. Family members who live far apart might be charged with miscommunication. However, Joni's own family was involved. Someone they could trust. Someone in the circle was close enough to witness the actual event. There was no way to continue saying that Jonathan and Susie were the only ones worried after what he said. There were now more voices than just two. Additionally, the situation radically shifts when multiple witnesses are present. The letter demonstrated the falsity of Joni's unification story. Behind the public declarations and smiles, there was uncertainty, fear, and division. Supporters who had taken her word for it felt that the revelation was treachery. They had been informed that there was no proof, but now they had proof. The matter was exacerbated by the fact that evidence written by her own son-in-law was not turned over to the authorities. Why keep it hidden? If the truth mattered, why hide something so crucial from investigators? For many, that was when the entire story began to disintegrate. What else was Joni willing to conceal if she could confidently claim in front of cameras that no other family members had spoken up, even when a letter was silently present in the background? What other parts of the official story had been altered? The public didn't receive the entire message, but even rumors of its existence quickly circulated. People started to pose more challenging queries. Was Daystar merely defending itself, or was it truly defending the truth? In actuality, the letter did more than just cast doubt on the narrative. People's perceptions of everything surrounding the Lamb family were altered. It demonstrated that quiet did not equate to innocent and that the voices we do not hear are sometimes the ones that are suppressed the most. As soon as that insight became clear, Daystar's story's gleaming exterior started to fade. What had appeared to be a united front was now shown as a flimsy act supported by loyalty, pressure, and the wish that no one would ever discover the true nature of that page. The Lamb family always appeared unflappable from the outside. They stood together through every storm, spoke in unison during interviews, and smiled together on stage. They were the epitome of unity. That image served them well for years. Supporters relied on it, viewers trusted it, and detractors were unable to refute it. In particular, Joni Lamb put a lot of effort into preserving that tale. She uttered it often and with conviction. Pete had only been accused of misconduct by Jonathan and Susie. She insisted that everyone else stand alongside Pete. The public interpreted that as a sign of family unity. Even though one branch might be broken, the tree remained sturdy. However, as the truth was gradually revealed, it revealed something quite different. It wasn't a united front. It was created, practiced, and meticulously upheld. Behind the curtain, there was uncertainty, uneasiness, and even documented evidence that Pete's actions had upset other family members. Joni's husband, J.W., and her own daughter, Rebecca, had been among the first to express concern. They weren't only bystanders. They had witnessed enough to write and discuss it, and at one point they even assured Jonathan and Susie that they would keep their word by them in the event that the matter went to trial. One does not make such a commitment carelessly. It indicated that they thought something was amiss. The issue is that the public was never made aware of that story. Rather, J.W. and Rebecca became silent over time. J.W.'s letter never made it to the police. Their readiness to support Jonathan without reservation and slowly, Susie disappeared. From the outside, it appeared as though nothing had ever occurred, that they had never been bothered in the first place, and that the idea of unity had survived because of the silence. Joni could tell the world that it was merely a family fight, a disagreement between a son and his mother, as long as Jonathan and Susie were the only ones talking. It's simple to ignore two voices. However, it's far more difficult to justify four. People wanted to believe in togetherness, thus it functioned as an illusion. Nobody watching Daystar wanted to believe that the family was split, particularly over something as agonizing and sinister as child-related charges. A unified family was easier to accept, cleaner, and simpler, and Joni was skilled at framing it in a way that seemed plausible. She discussed personal grudges, misunderstandings, and bitterness. She appealed to the audience's faith, urging them to ignore the commotion and have faith in her leadership. It was effective as, for a while, nobody outside the inner circle was aware that other voices had previously been heard. In actuality, the Lamb family was polarized from the beginning. Some were unable to disregard the weight of what they had witnessed. Others were concerned about the consequences of speaking up. It was more than just a ministry, Daystar. It was their family name, a source of income, a legacy, and a huge stage. Going against the grain meant jeopardizing relationships, reputations, financial stability, and everything else. Silence became the safest option for many who felt the risk was too great to bear. Silence, however, does not negate what was observed. It just buries it and waits for it to come back. The idea of a united front becomes a weapon, which is what makes it so terrible. It was more than just keeping Pete safe. By saying that everyone else was together, it was intended to isolate Jonathan and Susie. Joni depicted her daughter-in-law and son as the only troublemakers are dividing people. They were terribly upset by that framing. They weren't allowed to bear the consequences of their charges by themselves. They were labeled as unreliable and disloyal. Although others had previously expressed similar concerns, Rebecca and J.W.'s silence didn't just remove a portion of the narrative. It made the fake one stronger. People realized that unity had been a show as the reality gradually surfaced. It was not the fortitude of a religiously bonded family. It was a powerful image designed for followers and cameras. There were strained discussions behind closed doors, uncomfortable disagreements, and times of uncertainty that were never realized. The family did not have a common belief. Fear, loyalty, and the unavoidable decision between image and truth split them. When supporters eventually discovered that J.W. had written a letter and that Rebecca and her husband had already pledged to help Jonathan and Susie, the delusion broke. The concept of a unified family was exposed as a meticulously crafted narrative. At that point, trust started to erode. Because you start to question what else has been concealed if you discover that a leader has concealed division. The united front ultimately never came to be. Harmony was never the point. It has to do with control. In order for the public to believe in loyalty where there was only fear and in strength when there was just silence, the narrative had to be shaped. That insight was devastating to those who had thought the Lamb family was untouchable. It demonstrated that even truth could be compromised for appearance in a family based on ministry and faith, and coerced unity can be nothing more than a front. Myers would look more familiar than Ian, all eons away from Los Angeles. Pete's behavior should have been recognized for what it truly was when the investigation into it was halted. A pause, not a conclusion. However, Daystar and the Lambs were skilled in spinning it. They utilized that moment to reframe it as evidence of Pete's innocence rather than acknowledging that the case was put on hold because the accused youngster was too vulnerable to continue reliving her pain. They made it apparent in broadcasts, interviews, and meticulous formulated claims. They informed supporters that the matter was finished and that there was no proof Pete had been completely cleared. And people believed it for a time. This is when framing becomes important. The majority of individuals are unaware of the distinction between a case that has been paused and one that has been closed. The general public assumes there must be nothing to look into if the police aren't taking any action. Joni and her colleagues relied on that very thing. The detective's reasoning that pressuring the youngster for testimony at that point could cause greater harm was not mentioned. They failed to mention that if the youngster could talk, the case may be renewed at any time. Rather, they depicted a more hygienic and cozy scene. The family could now proceed since Pete had been proven right. However, such was not the reality. The absence of proof was never the focus of the investigation. It was about defending an unprepared child. Everything is changed by that detail, but it was kept secret from the public for two main reasons. First, it made it possible for Daystar to reassure their funders and viewers that everything was well. Second, it provided them with material to disparage Jonathan and Susie, the only two family members who continue to express their opinions in public. Had taken place. Joni might use the pause as evidence each time questions arose. If there was really something to these accusations, the police wouldn't have stopped. She could say that to the audience, and it was spoken so often that it became a self-contained truth. Despite the fact that reality was entirely. However, pastors and fans kept saying it, and eventually the pause itself came to be seen as a sign of Pete's innocence. In terms of public relations, it was an excellent move, but it was also incredibly deceptive. The fact that this deception silenced those who were sounding the alarm was its most concerning aspect. Susie and Jonathan were portrayed as dishonest, resentful, and vindictive since Pete had previously been exonerated by the police. That was untrue. However, the way it was presented allowed their fans to disregard anything that didn't fit the narrative. Anyone who attempted to discuss the matter might be written off as inciting unrest. Since, ultimately, have the authorities already determined that nothing was present? Additionally, it allowed the Lamb family to bolster their story of solidarity. They built an almost impenetrable wall by combining the pause with the assertion that just two persons had implicated Pete. If JW hadn't given the police his letter, there wouldn't have been any official documentation of his observations. The story of the two lone accusers held up without Rebecca and JW openly acknowledging their early support of Jonathan and Susie. Furthermore, the audience had no reason to question Joni's account of what happened because the pause was being presented as evidence. Those who were aware of the facts, however, were irritated behind the scenes. The investigator on. It was evident from the case. Pete was still not innocent. Although that message was never included in the press releases or broadcasts, it was left open that charges could be brought if the situation altered. Rather, the ministry and the family employed chosen language, blurring the boundaries between legalese and religious declarations. They even said that God himself had stepped in to keep Pete safe and put an end to unfounded charges. The risk of this type of manipulation is that it was persuasive to viewers who trusted the Lambs, not just comforting. People are denied the opportunity to establish their own opinions when you give a partial truth as the complete tale. Those who supported Pete's innocence weren't acting irrationally. They were using the information that Daystar provided them, which was all the information they had. They may have reacted quite differently if they had been informed of the true cause of the halt. However, they were manipulated rather than informed. Additionally, time was bought by manipulating the pause. Daystar could resume normal operations as long as the public thought the case was over. The broadcasts continued, the donations continued to flow in, and Joni was able to take the stage with assurance and without question. However, the fissures persisted. About JW's letter, rumors began to spread. Word slowly got out that the family was divided. People felt deceived when they eventually discovered the true reason the lawsuit had been put on hold. They became aware that the whole story had not been given to them. And the treachery was more profound than the charges themselves. Trust is essential to a Christian ministry. Just because they enjoy the programming doesn't mean that people watch or donate. They act in this way because they think the leaders are trustworthy, dependable, and open. It is difficult to rebuild that trust after it has been damaged. Furthermore, in this instance, the trust wasn't broken just by the charges. The way the family treated them shattered it. By transforming a complex, agonizing truth into a straightforward fabrication. It was more than just a public relations ploy to manipulate the halted probe. It was a conscious decision to preserve a reputation at the price of the truth. It utilized quiet as evidence of innocence and transformed a vulnerable child's struggle into a talking point. Additionally, even while it was effective in the near term, it merely exacerbated the impact over time. Because supporters were forced to confront the most difficult question of all after learning the truth. What else may the family have lied about? Have they told lies? The pause ultimately failed to establish innocence. It simply demonstrated the lengths people can go to in order to preserve their reputation. It demonstrated how one halted word may be turned into a shield and utilized to keep power and quiet dissenting opinions. The truth, however, has a way of getting through. And when it did, the meticulously crafted storyline fell apart, revealing the agonizing truth of what had been kept hidden for so long. Never is stillness simply silent. It is heavy. It forms results and makes decisions. Silence turned out to be one of the most effective strategies in the tale of Daystar and the Lamb family. It was not about what was said behind closed doors, but about what was said in front of the cameras. And there was a cost to that silence. Family members, the ministry, and those who trusted them all paid a price. There was no stillness in the beginning. The initial accusations made against Pete, Jonathan and Susie Lamb openly spoke up. Even if it meant risking everything and defying their own family, they didn't conceal what they thought had happened to their daughter. They were not alone at that moment. Another couple in the family, Rebecca and her husband J.W. Weiss, stated that they too thought something was off. J.W. even detailed what he had personally witnessed in a letter. And there appeared to be strength in numbers for a brief period of time. However, that strength vanished over time. J.W. and Rebecca, who had previously said that they would support Jonathan and Susie during the legal proceedings, fell silent. They ceased to discuss what they had witnessed in public. They declined to give their letter to the police, despite the fact that it had the potential to alter the course of the entire inquiry. From the outside, Jonathan and Susie appeared to be totally alone, as if they had switched sides. What had earlier been a collection of worried voices was now reduced to two individuals who could be characterized as resentful troublemakers. Why did that? Does silence occur? Only those who are directly involved can provide a complete answer to that question. However, the pressure they were under is easily apparent. Daystar was more than just a family company. It was a huge ministry with wealth, power, and influence. Opposing it didn't only imply that the dinner would become tense. Table. It meant jeopardizing financial stability, reputations, careers, and social position. You had to remain silent in order to remain within the circle of safety. Speaking up meant being shunned. Silence was therefore the safer option. By remaining silent, Rebecca and J.W. escaped the criticism that Susie and Jonathan encountered from the public. Their position in the ministry remained intact. Angry viewers who thought they were disparaging God's chosen leaders did not target them. They maintained their relationships, their income, and their roles. However, that decision had a price. Because they let the public accept a false story by remaining silent. Speaking came at an instantaneous and cruel cost to Jonathan and Susie. The ministry they had dedicated their life to was cut off from them. Both their wealth and their power were taken away from them. They were painted as outsiders and liars who had betrayed their own family for personal gain. They bore the weight of being the only ones who dared to speak what others were too scared to do in private. They felt the truth was more important than their comfort, so even though that loneliness was debilitating, they refused to compromise. The cost of silence was slower but no less significant for Rebecca and J.W. They might have escaped public humiliation and maintained their position in the family, but they had to live with the fact that they knew something was wrong but did nothing about it. Weight like that doesn't go away easily. It persists in silent times, in nighttime prayers, in the persistent reflection on what may have happened if they had remained firm. Although they were temporarily shielded by silence, it also connected them to the deceit that transpired. The broader ministry also had to pay a price. Silence kept the machine operating in the near term. Supporters remained devoted, broadcasts continued, and donations kept coming in. However, trust started to erode when tidbits of information started to surface, when rumors about JW's letter spread, and when the true reason the probe was put on hold became apparent. When they discovered they hadn't been given the complete story, those who had trusted all Joan said felt deceived, and the betrayal went beyond the accusations themselves. After trust is, it is nearly hard to regain what has been lost. Additionally, silence changed how the claims were seen by the general public. The assertions were written off as a family quarrel rather than a grave warning. The burden of the entire conflict fell on Jonathan and Susie. Those who had previously pledged to support them moved aside, but that quiet did more than shield Pete, it tarnished those who dared to speak. And in doing so, it gave supporters the sense that Daystar had the better of the truth. All of this was made possible by the ministry's influence. Influence often whispers rather than shouts. It presses rather than always demands. It is frequently not necessary to explicitly tell people inside powerful systems to keep silent. Before they ever open their mouths, they are aware of the price of speaking. That is the function of influence. It fosters an atmosphere in which remaining silent seems to be the only option. However, quiet is never impartial. Every time someone stays silent, they allow a false narrative to continue to thrive. Every omitted word, concealed letter, and unresolved query becomes a part of the cover. Additionally, it gets more difficult to break the silence the longer it lasts. Ultimately, the quiet surrounding Daystar did not shield the truth. It was buried. The family wasn't healed by it. They were split apart by it. It failed to maintain trust. It was demolished. And when the truth eventually came to light, those who had remained silent had to face the fact that their choice had only postponed the inevitable. While the cost of speaking the truth is always considerable, the cost of remaining silent might be even greater. Because silence alters reality in addition to keeping secrets. It transforms witnesses into cowards, victims into liars, and leaders into people acting for the audience. And when that fact eventually breaks open, revealing the once safe silence for what it truly was. A decision at a price no one can afford. Get away.